Hello, my dear viewers. Today will be a very interesting story. I recommend watching the video to the end. Put a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and be sure to write comments on what you liked or did not like, and if you have an interesting criminal story from your life. Write your story in the comments and I will make a video and tell your story here on the channel. Okay, I have detained you. I wish you a good mood and viewing. I never thought my life would take the turn it did. My name's Charlotte Hayes. I'm 36, a single mother to a 17-year-old boy named Ethan, and until a year ago, I thought I had everything under control. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it? It all started on a Thursday evening at Café Loon, a cozy little spot in downtown Boston where I worked as a waitress. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I loved the regulars who came in, each with their own quirks and stories. That's where I met him, Vince Delacroix. The first time I saw him, he was sitting at the far corner table, dressed in a crisp navy suit that looked like it cost more than my entire year's salary. He had this aura about him, confidence, power, and a hint of danger that made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Can I get you anything else?" I'd asked, holding my pen nervously over my notepad. He glanced up, his deep green eyes locking with mine. "Just your name," he said smoothly, a faint smile playing on his lips. That was the beginning. Vince started coming to the cafe regularly, always sitting in the same spot, always asking for me to take his order. He was charming, attentive, and had this magnetic quality that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I knew there was something off. He was too polished, too secretive, but I ignored the warning bells. I hadn't dated anyone seriously since Ethan's dad walked out on us when he was a baby. I told myself it was time to let someone in, to take a chance. Vince made me feel seen, like I was more than just a struggling single mom trying to make ends meet. Ethan, on the other hand, wasn't thrilled when I told him about Vince. "Mom, you don't even know him," he said one night after I mentioned I had plans with Vince for dinner. "I know enough," I replied, feeling defensive, "and he makes me happy. That's all that matters, isn't it?" Ethan didn't argue, but I could tell he didn't trust Vince. Maybe it was just teenage stubbornness, or maybe he didn't like the idea of someone stepping into his dad's place. I brushed it off, too caught up in the whirlwind of my new romance to see the cracks forming around me. It wasn't until weeks later that I started noticing the little things about Vince, the way his phone was always buzzing, but he'd never answer in front of me. The vague answers he gave when I asked about his work. And then there was the night he picked me up in a car I could only describe as mobster chic, with tinted windows and an entourage of men who looked like they'd walked straight out of a gangster movie. "Who are they?" I'd asked nervously as we drove to the restaurant. "Business associates," he said with a shrug, his tone casual but his grip on the wheel tight. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this man who made me laugh, who looked at me like I was the only woman in the world, was just another successful businessman with a few eccentricities. But deep down, I knew the truth was far darker than I wanted to admit. It was a chilly Friday evening when Vince invited me to his estate for the first time. Estate might be an understatement. It was more like a fortress. The sprawling mansion sat at the end of a long, tree-lined driveway, surrounded by high walls and guarded by men who looked like they hadn't smiled in years. "Wow," I whispered as he led me inside. The interior was a stunning mix of modern luxury and old-world charm, with marble floors, ornate chandeliers, and walls lined with priceless art. "Like it?" Vince asked, his hand resting lightly on my back. "It's overwhelming," I admitted, my voice tinged with awe and unease. "Get used to it," he said with a wink. "This is your life now." I laughed nervously, but his words lingered in my mind. Your life now. I wasn't sure if he meant it as a promise or a warning. As the weeks passed, I began to see more of Vince's world, and it terrified me. I couldn't ignore the phone calls he took behind closed doors, the late-night meetings with men whose faces were hardened by years of violence. I'd catch snippets of conversations, words like shipment, territory, and cleanup that made my stomach churn. One evening, while Vince was out, I decided to snoop. It wasn't something I was proud of, but my gut was screaming that something was wrong. I found a locked drawer in his study, and after searching his desk, I discovered the key. Inside were files, photographs, and maps. One file caught my eye. It had the name of a local shipping company scrawled on the tab. I flipped it open to find lists of names, transaction amounts, and dates. My heart pounded as I realized I was looking at evidence of smuggling operations, money laundering, and even murders. I slammed the drawer shut and hurried back to the living room, my hands trembling. When Vince returned, he noticed my unease immediately. "Something wrong, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "No," I lied, forcing a smile, "just tired." He didn't press, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me longer than usual. Things came to a head 2 weeks later when Ethan came home one evening with a black eye and a split lip. "What happened?" I demanded, rushing to his side. "It's nothing," he muttered, brushing me off. "It's not nothing," I insisted. "Who did this to you?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Mom, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to freak out." I sat down, bracing myself. "Okay, I promise." "I've been working with this group," he began, his voice low. "We're trying to expose criminal organizations in the city, bring them down from the inside, and Vince is one of our targets." The room spun. "What are you talking about?" "Mom, Vince is a crime lord," Ethan said bluntly. "He runs one of the biggest mafia operations in the city. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, you name it. He's involved." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "No, that's not true. Vince isn't like that. He's dangerous, Mom," Ethan interrupted. "You have to get away from him. If he finds out what I'm doing, he won't think twice about coming after me or you." Tears filled my eyes as the weight of Ethan's words sank in. The man I'd fallen for wasn't just a businessman with a mysterious side. He was a monster. That night, I lay awake, torn between my feelings for Vince and the desperate need to protect my son. By morning, I knew there was no way this could end well. After Ethan's revelation, I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Every moment with Vince felt like a lie, every glance from him a potential threat, but I couldn't let him see my fear. If he suspected that Ethan or I knew the truth, I didn't even want to imagine what he might do. Ethan begged me to leave Vince immediately. "We'll go somewhere far away," he said. "Change our names, disappear. He'll never find us." But I knew it wasn't that simple. Vince had connections everywhere. Running wouldn't guarantee safety, and if I left abruptly, it might raise suspicions, putting us in even greater danger. For now, I had to stay. I had to pretend. That evening, Vince surprised me with a weekend getaway plan. "Pack your bags," he said, his voice full of excitement. "I've got something special lined up for us." "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to sound thrilled. "It's a surprise," he replied with a wink. "You'll love it." As I packed my things, my heart raced. I didn't trust this trip, but I couldn't refuse. If I acted differently, if I slipped up, it could all be over. Ethan was furious when I told him. "You can't go with him, Mom. What if he's setting you up?" I squeezed his hand, trying to reassure him. "I'll be careful, Ethan, I promise." Before I left, Ethan slipped a small recording device into my purse, just in case, he said. "If he says anything incriminating, we can use it to bring him down." The trip was to a secluded cabin in the mountains, miles away from any signs of civilization. The view was breathtaking: snow-capped peaks, endless forests, but I couldn't enjoy it. The isolation made my skin crawl. Over dinner, Vince was his usual charming self, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing me. His questions felt pointed, his smiles a little too knowing. "You've been quiet lately," he said, pouring me a glass of wine. "Everything okay?" Of course, I lied, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." He murmured, studying me. "You know, Charlotte, trust is everything in a relationship. Without it, there's no foundation." The words felt like a blade against my neck. "I trust you," I said quickly, completely. He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Good. Because I'd hate to find out you were keeping secrets from me." That night, as Vince slept, I turned on the recorder and placed it near his phone, hoping to catch something useful. I knew it was risky, but it was the only way to gather evidence without drawing suspicion. The next morning, Vince announced we'd be heading back to the city earlier than planned. "Something's come up with work," he explained. My stomach sank. I knew that couldn't be good. When we returned, I hurried to Ethan's room, handing him the recorder. "Check this," I whispered. "I don't know if it caught anything, but it's all we've got." Ethan plugged it into his laptop and began playing the audio. At first, it was just background noise, muffled footsteps, the sound of the fireplace crackling. But then we heard Vince's voice. "The kid's name is Ethan Hayes. He's been digging where he shouldn't. Make sure he understands what happens when people cross me." My blood turned to ice. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his face pale. He knows it's me." Panic set in as I realized Vince wasn't just suspicious, he was preparing to act. "We have to do something," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "We have to stop him before it's too late." But what could we do against someone like Vince? I didn't have an answer. I didn't sleep that night. Vince knew about Ethan, and I had no idea how much time we had before he made his move. The walls of my world felt like they were closing in, and I could hardly breathe. By morning, I had decided on a plan, though calling it a plan might have been a stretch. I would confront Vince, distract him, and give Ethan enough time to disappear. It was risky, but it was the only chance we had. "You're quiet again," Vince said as we had breakfast. His voice was calm, but his eyes held that unnerving sharpness I'd come to fear. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired." "I think there's more to it than that," he said, his tone darkening. He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. "You wouldn't lie to me, would you, Charlotte?" "No," I said quickly, my heart pounding. Why would you even think that? He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Loyalty is everything to me, he said quietly, when people betray me. Well, let's just say I make sure they regret it. I felt the blood drain from my face. He wasn't just talking, he was warning me. That afternoon, I pretended everything was fine, playing the role of the loving girlfriend while secretly texting Ethan. Me, he knows. You need to get out of the city. Now, Ethan, not without you. Me, Ethan, please don't argue. Just go. Ethan, I have a better idea. I'll meet you at the cafe tonight. We'll figure this out together. I didn't want to meet him, but I knew arguing would waste time we didn't have. So I agreed. When I told Vince I needed to run an errand, he didn't question it. But as I left the apartment, I had the sinking feeling that someone was watching me. At the cafe, Ethan was waiting in our usual booth, his face set with determination. I have something, he said, sliding a USB drive across the table. It's everything I've gathered on Vince. Evidence of his operations, his meetings, his crimes. If we get this to the FBI, they can take him down. That's great, I said, though my voice wavered. But how do we stay alive long enough to do that? Ethan's jaw tightened. I have a contact, a federal agent. I'll get this to him tonight. I shook my head. It's too dangerous. Let me do it, Mom. No, Ethan said firmly. This is my fight. You shouldn't even be involved. Before I could argue, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Vince. Vince, come home now. My chest tightened. He knew. We need to leave, I whispered, grabbing Ethan's hand. Now, but as we stepped outside, the black SUV screeched to a stop in front of the cafe. Men in suits poured out, guns drawn. Run! I screamed, shoving Ethan toward the alley. We sprinted down the narrow passage, dodging crates and trash bins. Behind us, I could hear the heavy footsteps of Vince's men. Ethan reached the end of the alley first, but as I followed, a hand clamped down on my arm. I turned to see one of Vince's enforcers, his face cold and expressionless. "Charlotte," he said, "Boss wants to see you." I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. Ethan's voice echoed behind me as I was dragged toward one of the SUVs. "Mom, go, Ethan," I shouted. "Get out of here." I only prayed he listened. They shoved me into the SUV, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in my chest. I could still hear Ethan's voice calling my name as the car sped away. I prayed he had gotten away, that he'd listen to me and disappear. The drive back to Vince's estate was suffocatingly silent, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional click of a radio from the driver. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it might burst from my chest. When we arrived, Vince was waiting in the grand foyer. He looked calm, too calm, that scared me more than if he'd been yelling. "Charlotte," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "come here." I stepped forward hesitantly, my legs trembling. "Vince, he held up a hand to silence me. "Do you think I'm a fool?" he asked, his tone deceptively soft. "No, of course not," I stammered. "Then why," he continued, taking slow, deliberate steps toward me, "have you and your son been playing games behind my back?" My stomach dropped. He knew everything. "Vince, please," I began, my voice breaking. "Ethan's just a kid. He doesn't understand." "Oh," He understands perfectly, Vince interrupted, his calm veneer cracking. He's been working with the feds. Do you have any idea what that could do to me? To everything I've built? I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know, I swear. Please, let him go. He's just trying to protect me. Protect you? Vince laughed bitterly. The irony, Charlotte, is that I was protecting you. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. He motioned to one of his men, who handed him a tablet. Vince tapped the screen, and a live feed appeared. My heart stopped when I saw Ethan on the screen, cornered in a warehouse, surrounded by Vince's men. No, I screamed, rushing toward him, but two of his guards held me back. Your son has been very busy, Vince said, his voice cold, but I'll give you a choice. I froze, my breath hitching. Your son's life, he said slowly, or yours. The words hit me like a freight train. You don't have to do this, I whispered, my voice shaking. Please, Vince, let him go. I'll do whatever you want. I already told you the terms, he said, his expression unreadable. Choose, Charlotte. The room spun as the weight of the decision pressed down on me. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. I thought of Ethan, his laugh, his stubbornness, the way he always stood up for what was right. He was my son, my everything. I couldn't let him die because of my mistakes. Take me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Vince raised an eyebrow, his expression softening for just a moment. Are you sure? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I'm sure. He sighed, almost as if he regretted what he had to do. You always had a strong heart, Charlotte, he said quietly. It's a shame it had to end this way. The last thing I saw was Vince nodding to one of his men before the world went black. Some say you see your life flash before your eyes when it ends, but all I saw was Ethan. I hoped my sacrifice was enough to save him, enough to give him a chance to live. When the news broke weeks later about the takedown of a major crime syndicate led by a brave young whistleblower, I wasn't there to see it. But I didn't need to be. Ethan had done what I couldn't. He brought down the monster I'd once loved, and in doing so, he honored the only thing that had ever mattered to me, family. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This will help me work better and faster for you. I would be grateful, so watch my other videos.